Kristen, and you're listening to Podcast and Amplify, a podcast for women entrepreneurs who want to amplify their voice and brand through podcasting and grow a wildly successful business. I'm the executive producer and host of 2 shows and an entrepreneur, and I love helping women grow their visibility, mindset, and business to the next level. Each week, I share tips on how to launch and leverage your podcast, and I'm bringing on the very best business leaders to give you advice on how to build your business empire. Let's amplify your voice and business. Hey friends, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Kristen, and today we're going to be talking about how to know when your podcast needs an upgrade. Typically, I give tips for new podcasters, people who are aspiring to become podcasters. But over the next few weeks, I'm going to shift a little bit and focus on those of you who already have a podcast and give you some tips and some strategies for really capitalizing on this asset that you already have. And if you're still in the stages of wanting to start a podcast, these episodes are still going to be really valuable for you because you're going to get a peek into what it's like to actually have a podcast and what things might come up for you down the line as you get into podcasting, as you begin to develop your show. Now, not all of these things will necessarily apply to you, but there are some things to kind of think about and just be aware of. So the reason why I wanted to do this series on knowing when it's time to upgrade or up level your podcast is because I see a lot of people in 1 or 2 camps. So the first is that you DIY'd your podcast, which I get in the beginning. As entrepreneurs, we tend to try to do everything ourselves. So it's like putting together a website and doing all the copy yourself. And then a year into it, realizing, oh, shoot, I should have hired a web designer and I probably should have hired a copywriter to do my website copy. You threw their podcast together, didn't really realize what you were getting into. You sort of didn't know what you didn't know, but pulled it together, put something out there, and now kind of like, what do I do now? What should be my next steps? What am I missing? I don't feel like I'm using this podcast to its full advantage. So what's next? The other scenario that I see is, maybe someone hired someone to help them, or they were very intentional about how they started their podcast. They went through the steps one by one, and they did kind of really think it through. But as many of us entrepreneurs do, they've pivoted their brand, or maybe it's not that they even pivoted, they just have evolved as a brand. And maybe they're serving new clients, a new level of client. Maybe they've gone through a rebrand and they're not really feeling like the podcast is matching up to this new place that they're in with their business, which is totally understandable because I know I've pivoted my own brand as I've gotten clearer and clearer on who it is that I want to serve, how I want to show up, what feels really authentic, aligned, impactful. Those things are going to naturally come up in your business. And I think it's just a product of having a business and owning a brand that's very connected to you and your values and your mission. So the podcast might not necessarily be matching that at this point. So those are the 2 scenarios I see in terms of maybe the podcast is not quite serving you in the way that you want it to. And you're wondering, okay, how do I upgrade this? How do I bring it into alignment, essentially? I know it's frustrating to put a podcast out there and then you experience sort of the dreaded pod fade. And if you don't know what pod fade is, or you've never heard that term, basically you start a podcast and then you sort of stop showing up for your podcast and you just kind of fade away. And that's okay. That's okay for that to happen. And if you're in that place where you're like, I'm not producing episodes anymore because I don't really feel like this is the right fit, or I don't really have a strong plan and I need to reassess what I'm doing here. Maybe you had an ongoing podcast and maybe that's not the right cadence for you. Maybe you need a seasonal podcast. Maybe you were speaking to female entrepreneurs and now you're thinking, oh, maybe that's not the right audience. And I've changed, my messaging. So how do I change my podcast to match that? So I'm going to talk about a couple ways that you can upgrade your podcast and the 3 things that you really want to focus on when you're doing that. Okay, so what are those 3 things? First of all, you want to go back to your mission. And if you've changed who you're serving, why you're serving those people, if you've gotten clearer on your why, that's what you want to start with and really have a clear statement around that. Understand sort of where you've been and where you are now. That way you can look at what you have currently in your podcast and bring in some of that new messaging, because I'm assuming if you've pivoted, you've created new messaging. So it's really just about bringing that evolved message into your podcast. Okay, so once you're really clear on that, you see the difference between sort of where you were and where you are today, and you understand how your message has changed, you want to start bringing that into your podcast. And the best way to do that is to redo your summary. So change up your summary so that it matches and is speaking to your new listeners, your new target audience. So you really want to draw those people in. I was working with a client recently and she wanted to do this very same thing, upgrade her podcast. She kind of threw it together and she was kind of like, I know that I'm not leveraging this to its full capacity. And I know that I started with a really strong belief in what I was doing. I still feel really called to have a podcast. I feel like that's my medium, but I know that I've evolved and my brand's evolved. And so what we did was I had her go through the Clarifying Your Podcast Vision workbook. I find that that's just a great place to start. Even if you did something like that in the beginning, you worked on your why and really writing that down. If you did that when you first started your podcast, that's great. But it's also great to do that again when you've rebranded or when you've pivoted. So that's what I've had her do because she had pivoted a little bit. And we ended up using a lot of those statements to really punch up her summary and speak directly to those listeners that she wanted to attract. And her summary was just so much more powerful and reflected what her business is today. So that's why summary is so important. Obviously, it's the first thing people are going to read about your show. So you have to make sure that you are speaking to your ideal audience and you really nail that. The second thing, it might sound very superficial, but it is important. So you want to take a look at your artwork. Is your artwork good? I define good as, is it something that when people are scrolling through, it's going to catch their eye? And so what catches people's eyes when you're scrolling and just looking at a small square? Well, typically that's a very clear title. Faces, we are humans, so we all respond to faces. And so I typically encourage my clients to have one large, friendly looking, smiling image of themselves so people can feel sort of like connected to you on a human level. So it has to look clean. I like a lot of white space, so it's not crowded. And it has a branded element to it, right? So it's going to be cohesive with your other branded content so that people see, oh, this is the same brand, or this is the same person that I know that I want to listen to. And the alternative to having a photo of yourself would be to have a really strong graphic. But again, it's really just having simple elements that have your brand colors. And it's just assessing, is this eye-catching and does it look professional? Those are kind of the two priorities because you have such a small space, but you can do a lot with a small space. So if you rebranded, your look is different, and you want to make sure that you are changing that artwork as well. And that's the great thing about artwork for your podcast. It is easily changeable. You can easily update it in your podcast host. And then the last thing that I will say that would also be affected by a rebrand, and even for those of you who just sort of threw yours together, when those of you who are in that scenario who DIY'd your podcast and you're just sort of not sure what to do with it, this applies to you as well. You're going to want to make sure that your topics are really on point, that your topics moving forward are speaking to your audience as well. And this is actually going to be easier for you to do because you've become more aligned with your mission. You've gotten more specific about who you want to serve, who you want your clients to be, who you want to draw into your audience for your show. So this should actually not create more work for you. It should actually come a little more naturally because typically as we evolve, it's because something is pulling us to, something is calling us to just modify things a bit. And what I think is get that much closer to doing what you are really meant to be doing. Okay, so those are a couple of reasons why you might need to upgrade your podcast and a few ways that you can think about doing that. But there are also a ton of other ways that you can optimize your podcast to be the most effective and aligned with your brand. And I've created a checklist to help you see if your podcast is still working for your business or if you're in need of some tweaking and modifying so that you're bringing in the right listeners. You're drawing in a community of people who really need to hear your message and want to connect with you. So I will link to the checklist in the show notes, and you can go ahead and download that. If you're curious or you've been feeling like you need a better plan for your show, or you're not quite sure what's missing, what the gaps are, you're in that I don't know what I don't know phase, or maybe you're like, I know something needs to change, but I want to make sure that I'm focusing on the right things because I know you as my listeners, you are all very smart, talented individuals, and you value your time and you don't want to waste it on things that are not effective. So again, go ahead and download that checklist. And next week, I'm going to be talking about ways to promote your podcast. And I'm really excited about next week's show because I'll be talking about some organic strategies that don't require paying for ads. And coming up as well, I'm going to be talking about pitching your podcast, who to pitch it to, and just all the different ways to get more ears listening to your podcast. So stay tuned for those upcoming episodes. I think you'll find them very helpful. And I'll also be sharing a new offer within the next few weeks. And so if you're interested in that, go ahead and get on the wait list. And I will link to that in the show notes as well. And this means you'll be the first to know about the offer. And I'll also be sharing some sort of behind the scenes things that only the waitlisters will be getting. So go ahead and sign up if you'd like to know what my next offer is. Jump on that waitlist. So if you loved this episode or you got a lot of value out of it, please make sure to share it with someone in your community who you know will benefit from listening to this show. It's really the best way to help us grow this podcast. And I so appreciate every referral, every suggestion to someone else is really powerful. And if you haven't reviewed or subscribed to the show yet, go ahead and go on over to your favorite streaming platform and click the subscribe button. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That is also another great way to support the show. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for listening to this show. It is so much fun for me to create this content for you and to share it with you. And I just really appreciate that you've tuned in and listened. So thank you. That's all I've got. And I will see you in the next episode. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe so you don't miss a show. And rating and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help support us. Always remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.